An old woman raised her hand on the courthouse steps in a wind that cut through her thin coat, and she bid $11 on a house the whole town had agreed was not worth 10. The auctioneer almost laughed. The crowd did laugh. A man in a good wool coat at the front turned around to see who had spoken, and when he saw a gray-haired woman with chapped knuckles and a husband beside her, whose boots had been resoled twice, he smiled the kind of smile that cost the smiler nothing. But what none of them knew, not the auctioneer, not the man in the wool coat, not even her husband of 51 years, was that down in the bottom of her left coat pocket she was holding a small grey river stone with a bird carved into it. And that bird, worn smooth under a thumb that had rubbed it every day for half a century, was about to lead her home to a child she had buried in a field with no name on the ground. Stay with me tonight. If you've ever loved someone the world decided not to remember these stories for you, settle in, turn the lights low. And if you'd like more stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe before we begin. The wind on those courthouse steps is just starting, and we have a long road ahead. Her name was Hattie Brevard, and she was 70 years old that autumn, though the cold made her look older. Her husband Walter was 73, a bricklayer, who had laid stone across 4 counties of the Blue Ridge since he was a boy of 15 carrying mortar for his uncle. They had been the kind of people you do not notice in a small town because they are always there. Walter at the lumberyard at 6. Hattie at the post office window with a stack of bills paid in cash and a smile for the clerk. A small white house on Maple Street with a porch swing and a sugar maple in the yard. 3 children raised under that roof. Thanksgivings for 11 when the cousins came. They had thought the way people do that they would die in that house. Then their middle child Elias, called Eli, came home one evening with a folder of bank papers and a plan for a chain of touchless car washes that he swore was the future. He needed his parents on the loan. Just their name, just to start. They signed because he was their son and because his eyes had the same hopeful light in them they had loved since he was 4. The car washes did not fail in a single dramatic crash. They failed the way most things fail, one slow month leaning on the next, until the small loan was the savings, and the savings was the second mortgage, and the second mortgage was the house on Maple Street with the porch swing and the maple in the yard. By the time the bank had taken what the bank wanted, Walter and Hattie had a faded blue half-ton truck, a storage unit they could not always pay on, and each other. Eli had stopped calling somewhere in the middle of all that, not because he did not love them, but because a man who cannot face what he has done will sometimes simply walk out of the room his parents are still sitting in. For a year and a half, they had been sleeping in the truck behind a discount store on the edge of Linden Hollow, Virginia, washing up in the sink of a gas station that did not mind. Hattie kept a comb and a small bar of soap in the glove box. Walter kept his pride somewhere harder to reach. They had come to the courthouse that Tuesday morning for the cheapest thing the county had on offer, because the man at the storage unit had said one more missed payment, and the contents would go to auction themselves. They had not even known what Lot 11 was when the clerk read it out in a flat voice that wanted to be inside. Improved parcel, 1 1/10 acres with structure edge of the old county road. Structure is a stone-dwelling condemned soul as his buyer assumes all liability. County is taking offers to clear the tax lien. Will open at $10. Nobody moved. A man in the third row smiled at his shoes. That's the Thorne place, somebody murmured, not quietly enough. Roof's in the cellar. You could not pay me to walk inside it. The man in the good wool coat at the front turned and grinned at the crowd. His name was Royce Van Meter, and he ran more new construction in the county than anyone. And he sat at the head of the council table on the second Thursday of every month. Let it go to the county, Royce called out easy and loud. Save everybody the embarrassment. A bulldozer's the only thing that place is fit for. People laughed. The clerk looked at his watch. $10, he said again. Anybody going, or do I mark no sale? Hattie's hand came up to her shoulder. She did not raise it high. She lifted it the way a woman lifts a hand in church when she is not entirely sure the question was meant for her, and she said in a voice that carried farther than she meant it to 11. The clerk blinked. For a moment he thought he had misheard. Then he understood that the small gray-haired woman at the back of the steps had outbid the silence by a single $1, and he did not know what to do with that. The crowd turned to look. Royce turned too, and when he saw who it was, an old woman in a thin coat with a tired man beside her, the grin came back wider. 11. Royce repeated, delighted. We've got $11 on the table for a pile of rocks. Anybody go 12? Anybody save these two good people from themselves? That was the laugh that landed hardest because it had her name folded inside it without ever saying it. People did not know Hattie Brevard. They saw a woman who looked like she ought to be counting change at a church sale, bidding her grocery money on a condemned house, and they laughed at the picture of it. Walter felt the laugh go through him. He felt it land in the place that a lifetime of being the man on the scaffold. The man with the trowel. The man nobody invited inside afterward. Had worn down to a callus. He said nothing. He reached over and laid his big rough hand flat against his wife's back between her shoulders and held it there. 11 going once, the clerk said, fighting a smile. 11 going twice. Sold to the lady in the back. See the office for paperwork. The gavel was just the clerk slapping a clipboard against his thigh. The wind took the sound away. It was over in under a minute. Nobody clapped. One woman drifting off toward her truck said loud enough to be a gift, "Well, bless their hearts," in the voice people use when they mean the opposite. Inside the courthouse office, the clerk had Hattie sign 3 forms and slide her $11 across the counter. A 10 and a single, both of them so worn they felt like cloth in her fingers. He gave her a brass key on a loop of dirty string and a yellow carbon copy that said the structure was unsafe for occupancy and the county was not responsible for what happened to anybody who went inside. "You folks got somewhere to actually stay?" the clerk asked. He was not unkind. He was just looking at the two of them and doing the math. "We've got somewhere now," Hattie said, and she put the key in her left coat pocket. It clinked softly against the smooth gray river stone that had been riding there for 50 years. She did not register the sound. Her thumb found the stone without her thinking about it, and rubbed once across the worn place where a carving she could no longer feel had once stood out under her skin. She had been doing it so long it was not even a habit anymore. It was the way she breathed. Out in the parking lot, Walter unlocked the truck on the second try because the lock had been sticking since spring, and he had stopped being able to fix it. Hattie climbed up into the cab and sat with both hands around the key, and for a moment she did not say anything. Then she laughed once soft, not the way the crowd had laughed. It was the laugh of a woman handed something she did not know how to hold. $11, she said. "Walter, it's the first thing in years that belongs to nobody but us." He started the engine. "Belongs to us, all right," he said. "Lord knows nobody else wanted it." The drive out took 20 minutes past the last of the town and onto the old county road where the asphalt gave up and turned to pale gray gravel. The Blue Ridge closed in on both sides, green and folded and old. Hattie had grown up out this way on a farm that was not there anymore, and she watched the land go by with a look on her face that Walter had learned over 51 years not to interrupt. "I used to know every fence post on this road," she said finally. "Funny what stays." The cottage sat back from the road behind a wall of blackberry cane and a leaning gate. From the cab it looked like a ruin and nothing more. Half the roof had fallen in, and the rafters that were left stuck up against the autumn sky like the ribs of something washed onto a beach. The windows were dark squares with no glass in them. A young birch had taken root in the front step and grown taller than the door. The chimney still stood square and patient against the hill behind. "Well," Hattie said. "Well," Walter agreed. They sat there a minute. Then Walter got out and his niece told him about it, and he walked up through the wet grass to the front of the house while his wife watched from the cab. He had built and repaired enough stone in his life to know in 5 seconds whether a wall had been thrown up by a hack or laid by somebody who knew the trade. Most of what he saw in his work was the first kind. This was not. He put his hand flat against the front wall, where the morning had not yet warmed it, and he felt the cold true face of the stone, and he went still. The stones were fieldstone, the rough grey limestone of these same hills, and not one of them was cut square. But they were fitted so close and so clever that the mortar was barely doing any work at all. Each stone turned and set, so its weight carried down into the one below it. The big ones low, and the small ones reading up the wall in a pattern that looked like it had simply happened that way, and absolutely had not. The corners were plumb after God knew how many winters. The lintel over the door was a single slab dressed by hand. Walter stepped back. He looked up the face of the wall, what was still standing of it, and something turned over in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. "Hattie," he called. "Come look at this." She came up beside him, careful in the grass, and she looked where he was looking, but she did not see what he saw. She saw a broken house. "It's terrible," she said gently. "The roof's terrible," Walter said. "Somebody let it go and the water got in, and that's a shame. But that's not the house." Hattie, look at the wall. Look at how it's laid. He ran his palm along a course of stone the way another man might run his hand along the flank of a good horse. "I couldn't build this. I'm telling you that, as a man who laid stone for a living. You could give me a lifetime, and I could not do this. Somebody who loved it built this, and they built it to stand 100 winters. And it's standing." Hattie looked at her husband instead of at the wall. It had been a long time since she had heard that note in his voice. "Then I suppose we ought to thank him," she said. "Whoever he was." "Whoever he was," Walter said. That was when they saw the dog. He was standing at the corner of the house where the wall met the overgrown side yard. A big grey animal gone gaunt with a square head and a coat exactly the color of the stone behind him. He was so still that he had been there the whole time, and they had not seen him. He was not a young dog. There was white in his muzzle and a weariness in how he stood square and balanced, ready to be gone in an instant. He watched them with steady dark eyes, and he did not bark and he did not wag. "Easy," Walter said low. "Easy now. We're not here to bother you." The dog did not move. Hattie, who had fed every stray that ever crossed her path since she was a girl and was not about to stop, went back to the truck and came out with the heel of a loaf they had been making last and a paper cup of water. She set them down at a careful distance on a flat stone, and then she backed away and sat herself down on the leaning gate to wait. "He's been living here," Walter said. "Look how he stands. He thinks this is his." "Maybe it is," Hattie said. "Maybe we're the strangers." It took the better part of an hour, but the dog ate. He came in low and quick and took the bread and went back to his corner with it. And then later he came for the water, and the second time he did not run as far. By the time the light was going long and gold across the hills, he had settled at the edge of the yard with his chin on his paws, watching them deciding. "He needs a name if he's going to stay," Hattie said. "He's got the color of the wall," Walter said. "Call him Moss." The dog's ear turned at the sound of it. That was all the agreement anybody got. They could not stay in the truck forever, and the cottage, ruin or not, was theirs. So as the sun dropped behind the quarry hills, they cleared a corner of the one room that still had most of its roof swept out the leaves, and the years with a broom Walter cut from a birch branch and laid out their bedroll on the dry stone floor. Hattie lit the small camp lantern they had carried in the truck since the start of the bad time. It threw a circle of warm light, and the rest of the house stood around them in the dark, enormous and quiet. By rights, it should have been frightening sleeping in a condemned house in the hills with the wind coming through the broken rafters. It was not. The walls were thick, and they held the day's small warmth, and Moss had come as far as the doorway and lay across the threshold with his back to them, facing out on guard, though nobody had asked him to. Walter could not sleep. He never could the first night anywhere. He took the lantern off the floor and went slow around the room. His bad knee stiff, looking the old mason's work over, with the light held close to the stone. The fireplace was the heart of it. A great squared opening with a stone mantel, and a chimney that ran up true into the dark. He held the lantern close to the dressed stone of the jamb down low where nobody would think to look, and that was where he found the carving. It was small, no bigger than his thumb, cut clean into the corner of one block at a height where you would only ever see it if you got down with a light. A bird. It had a fat little body, and its tail cocked up, every feather marked no bigger than a coin, and so finely done that in the moving lantern light it looked ready to hop off the stone. A wren. Walter crouched there a long time looking at it. Something about it pulled at the edge of his memory and would not come loose, like a name he had known his whole life and could not quite say. He had seen this bird before. He could not think where. Across the room in the bedroll, Hattie had her hand in her left coat pocket. The same coat pocket as always. Her thumb moved over the small grey stone the way it had 100,000 times. She was half asleep, and she did not know what her husband was looking at. And Walter did not know that the thing on the chimney and the thing in his wife's pocket had been made by the same hand. There were only 15 feet of dark stone room between them, and 50 years of silence, and they did not know. He put the lantern out and felt his way back to her and lay down. He was almost asleep when Moss got up. The dog rose from the doorway without a sound and crossed the dark room past them, and Walter felt the brush of him go by. Moss went to the far end to the back wall, where a heavy fallen shelf and a heap of broken plaster blocked the corner, and he stood there. Then he lay down facing the wall, his nose nearly to the stone, and from deep in his chest came a sound that was not a growl and was not a whine. A low, steady note, the sound a dog makes at a thing he cannot get to. Moss Walter said quietly, "Hey, settle." The dog did not settle. He stayed where he was, his whole attention fixed on that one corner of that one wall, as if the rest of the house did not exist. Walter lay in the dark and listened to him, and he thought about the wall he could not have built, and the little bird he could not place, and the dog who would not leave the back corner alone. He sat up slow on one elbow. "There's something behind that wall," he said. "Whatever's behind there has waited a long time," Hattie said from the bedroll. "It can wait until you can see what you're doing. Come lie down before you fall down." He came and lay down. Moss stayed at the wall a while longer, then gave it up and returned to the doorway and his post against the night. The next morning the dog was at that corner again, before either of them had their boots on. Walter stood watching him with a cup of cold coffee in his hand, and he filed the thing away because a house with no roof has a way of deciding a man's priorities for him. Mortar first, then felt for the roof, then whatever the dog was so sure of. He left Hattie at the cottage with the broom and drove the truck into town for supplies. Linden Hollow had two streets that called themselves anything. And on the corner where the old county road met the main one, there was a low brick building with a hand-painted sign that said Bly's, and a front step worn into a soft dip from 100 years of boots. Walter noticed the step before he noticed anything else, because the stone of it was cracked clean across, and somebody had laid a board over the crack so people would not turn an ankle. That kind of thing offended him. Inside it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the kind of warm pie nobody bakes for strangers. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was about his age, broad and gray, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and a dish towel over her shoulder, and a face that had served a lifetime of breakfasts and was not impressed by much. "You're the rock people," she said. It was not unkind. It was just true. "I suppose we are," Walter said. "Sit down. Coffee's fresh. You look like you've been sleeping in a quarry." She poured him a cup he had not ordered and set it in front of him. And when he reached for the few worn bills in his shirt pocket, she waved her hand at him, the way you wave at a fly. "Sit," she said. Her name was Cora Bly, and she had run the place since her husband had passed 11 winters back, and she had been born 3 streets over, and never once lived anywhere else, and she knew everything that had happened in this part of the county for longer than Walter had been alive. When he told her between bites of eggs he had not meant to accept that they had bought the old Thorne place, she went very quiet. She set the coffee pot down on the counter with a small, careful sound. "Now there's a name," she said. "I haven't heard anybody say that name out loud in a long time." "Tell me about him," Walter said. "I've been crawling over that man's work for a day, and I can't build what he built." "Who was he?" Cora pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which she did not do for everyone. "Ansel Thorne," she said. "Came over from Cornwall as a young man in the 30s when the quarry up the road was still going strong and they needed men who knew hard rock. Half this town's grandfathers came the same way, and most of them blended right in. Thorne never did. Kept to himself, talked funny, lived out on that road alone. People decided he was strange, and you know how a town is about strange. They used his hands and forgot his name." "What do you mean, used his hands?" "I mean every dollar of stonework this town ever needed. Ansel Thorne did, and did cheap, and did better than it had any right to be done, and got a nod for it if he was lucky." She shook her head. "Cut the cornerstone for the Methodist church. Laid the steps up to the bank. Built the war memorial in the square with every name straight and level. And when it was finished, they paid him short and went home and called him the hermit. Children dared each other to run up and touch his gate." She looked at Walter over the top of her glasses. "This town didn't forget that man," she said. "It never troubled itself to learn him in the first place." Walter turned his coffee cup in his big hands. "He carved a little bird on my chimney," he said. "A wren, down low where you'd never see it." Cora smiled for the first time, and it changed her whole face. "He put that wren on everything he ever laid," she said. "His mark. My Henry used to say if you found Ansel Thorne's wren on a wall, You could lean your whole life against it and it wouldn't move. The smile faded. He died 12 years back now, alone out there. Nobody noticed for a while, which tells you everything. County took the place for the taxes and let it rot. And now here you are. Here we are, Walter said. He paid for the mortar across the street, and before he drove home, he walked the 2 blocks to the square because he had to see it for himself. The war memorial stood in the middle of a patch of dead grass, a tall squared shaft of the grey local limestone with the names of the county's dead cut into all 4 faces. Walter had passed 100 memorials like it in his life and never looked twice. He looked now. He walked all the way around the base, bending to it with his hand braced on his knee until he found it low on the north corner where the morning shadow lay. A wren, the same little fat bird tail cocked up, every feather marked. He stood up slowly. He thought about the bank steps and the church cornerstone, and he did not need to go look at them to know what he would find. One man, one forgotten man, had laid the stone the whole town stood on and walked past every day, had cut the names of their honored dead into rock that would outlast all of them, and had signed his life's work with a bird so small you had to kneel to see it. And they had let his own house fall into the cellar and laughed at the 2 old fools who bought it. You cannot fake 40 years in a wall. Walter said to no one. To the memorial. The stone tells on you. He drove home with a quiet in him that was close to anger and close to grief, and was really just the feeling of seeing a man clearly that the world had decided not to see. Hattie had her own quiet that afternoon, and she did not know yet that it had anything to do with Ansel Thorne. While Walter had been in town, she had walked the land, all 1 1/10 acres of it, and passed it down the old county road to where the trees opened on a wide flat field behind a sagging wire fence. She had stood at that fence a long time. Beyond it, the ground rolled away in low humps under the long grass. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, set in rough rows, every one of them unmarked. No stones, no names, just the grass and the shapes of the ground where the earth had been turned and settled again. She knew that field. The old county home had stood up the rise behind it, the poorhouse, the place they sent people with nowhere else to go. And Hattie Brevard, who had been Hattie Sumner, once had cooked and washed there, as a girl of 19 for $2 a week and her dinner. She knew what the field was. It was where the home buried the ones nobody came for, the poor and the strangers and the ones who died with no money for a churchyard plot. And she knew, though she had not let herself form the thought in words in more than half a lifetime, that somewhere out under that grass in a spot she could no longer find was the only grave she had any real business at. January of 1973. She had been 19 years old and married 6 months. The baby had come too early in a hard winter, and lived 4 days, and then she had not, and there had been no money for a plot or a marker or anything else, and the county had taken her and put her out in that field with the others. Hattie had gone back in the spring to find her, and could not tell one patch of grass from the next, and she had sat down in the wet ground and understood that her daughter was gone twice now. She had never told Walter what she had named the baby. She had never told anyone. The name had stayed inside her with the little river stone she had picked up that afternoon. When she rose to go, the one with the small carving on it she had not been able to make out then, and had stopped being able to feel now under her thumb. She stood at the fence with her hand in her left coat pocket around the smooth stone, and her chest went tight and old. And after a while she walked back up the road and did not say where she had been. That evening, Walter built the fire up in Ansel Thorne's great square hearth, and for the first time in over a year, they sat with their backs warm. Moss came inside as far as the warmth and lay down with his eyes on the corner of the back wall. He had not stopped watching it since they arrived. Walter saw him watching, and he thought about the wall and the bird, and the way the dog kept his vigil, and he opened his mouth to say something about it. And that was when they heard the truck on the gravel. It came up slow and parked itself square on their grass without asking. A big clean truck, the kind that has never been near a quarry. Royce van Meter stepped down out of it in his good wool coat, and he stood with his hands on his hips and looked the place over with a smile like he already owned it. Moss got to his feet inside the doorway and stood very still. Mr. and Mrs. Brevard Royce called out, easy and warm. I had to come see it for myself. I truly did. I'm here to do you a kindness, folks. $2,000 cash today for this lot. That's near 200 times what you paid. You take it, you find yourselves a warm room in town before the snow, and everybody comes out ahead. Walter set his coffee cup down on the hearthstone. He looked at the man on his grass for a long moment. "Why do you want it?" he said. The smile did not change, but something behind it adjusted. "Like I said," Royce said, "to help you out of a bad spot." "Nobody pays 200 times for a bad spot to help an old man," Walter said. "What's the land to you? It's an eyesore is what it is." The friendliness was thinner now, and the man underneath was easier to see. "It's the last lot on that whole stretch I don't have a hand in Brevard. And I'm putting something out here this town's going to be proud of. And it does not need a falling down pile of rock and 2 squatters in the middle of it." He took a step closer. "I'm being generous. You want to think hard before you turn down generous. Because the other way this goes, the county takes another look at that condemnation order, and you're out of here with nothing and no check. I'd rather not. But that's up to you." There it was. Hattie in the doorway saw her husband hear the threat for what it was. "We're not selling," Walter said. Royce stood up straight. He looked at the two of them and at the dog at the door, with his head low, and at the tarp Walter had not yet had time to put on the roof. And he laughed once short, the same laugh as the crowd on the steps. "You will," he said, "one way or the other." He got in his truck and backed it across their grass and was gone down the gravel toward town. The fire popped behind them. Moss had not taken his eyes off the road. Hattie stood in the doorway with her hand in her coat pocket and her thumb on the worn place on the stone, and she did not know yet that the bird carved into it was the same bird her husband had found on the chimney that morning. She only knew that something had begun and that something else was waiting, and that for the first time in a year and a half, she was afraid not of being forgotten, but of being seen. Behind her, in the dark of the back room against the wall, the dog would not leave. The heavy fallen shelf creaked once in the cooling air, as if a house that had held its breath for 12 years had just decided very quietly to start letting it out. The tail lights of Royce Van Metter's truck went red at the bend of the gravel road, and then they were gone, and the only sound left was the fire and the slow tick of the lantern cooling on the hearthstone. Walter did not move from where he stood. Hattie did not turn from the doorway. They had spent 51 years learning each other's silences, and this one had a shape to it neither of them had felt before. It was the shape of a man who had come to their door at supper time to tell them he could take the only roof they owned, and had said it smiling. Walter spoke first, and not loud. "Then we'd better make it harder to take," he said. He went to the corner where he had set his tools. The small canvas roll he had carried in the truck through every bad month, and he laid them out on the hearthstone the way another man might lay out cards. A pointing trowel, a 4-pound mallet with a hickory handle so worn it had taken the shape of his fist, a few cold chisels, a spirit level that had belonged to his uncle, and a plumb bob on a length of waxed string. It was not much. It was what one man had needed when one man was all the world had asked him to be. He looked at the tools a long time, and then he looked at his wife. "I don't know if we can fix this house before that man can find a way to take it," he said. "But I know it'll stand longer with a roof than without one. I'll start in the morning." Hattie crossed the room and sat down beside him on the hearthstone. She put her hand on his knee, the bad one. "You're not going up on a roof alone," she said. "I've been up on 1,000 roofs. You were 30 on most of them." He gave her a look that was almost a smile, and she squeezed his knee once, and that was the agreement. Moss did not lie down again that night. He paced from the doorway to the back wall, and from the back wall to the doorway, slow and steady, until Hattie finally went to him and put her hand flat on his head, and stood with him there a while, neither of them speaking. The wall the dog kept guarding stood patient in the dark, and somewhere behind the heavy fallen shelf the cold air moved, the way cold air moves in a place with more rooms than a person can see. In the morning, Walter went up. He climbed onto the section of roof that was still mostly there, with a coil of cheap rope around his shoulder, and a tarp under his arm, and his bad knee held together by stubbornness. He had cut poles from the birch stand at the side yard the day before, peeled and trimmed them, and now he meant to bridge the open half of the roof with the poles, and lash the tarp over them and call it winter. It was an ugly fix. It was the fix a man does when he has $11 to his name, and the snow already smells close in the morning air. It did not go well. The first pole slipped out of his hand as he was lifting it up to himself, and it slid down the pitch and clattered into the wet grass below, and Hattie called up, "Quick, are you all right?" And he said yes through his teeth, and did not say anything else. The second pole went up, But when he tried to drive a 10-penny nail through the end of it into the rotten old plate, the plate split clean along the grain and the nail went straight through into nothing. He sat on his heels up there on the slope and put the flat of his hand against the warm shingle and breathed. There is a kind of failing a man does at 73 that he did not do at 30. At 30 you fail and you swear and you start again. At 73 you fail and the failing tells you very quietly that you are not the man you were. It is not a thought you can argue with. It just sits there with you on the roof. It took him most of 2 days to get the tarp up at all. By the end, his hands shook when he tried to hold the cup at supper. Hattie did not say anything about the shaking. She set the cup down on the hearthstone within his reach and turned back to the pot. And that was the kindest thing anybody had done for him in a long time. The tarp held the first rain. That was the small thing he held on to. Word got out about the rock people slow at first, the way word gets out in a place like Linden Hollow. A car would slow at the gate on a Sunday afternoon, and the faces inside would turn and look, and sometimes there was laughter you could see but not hear through the glass. And then the car would drive on. Twice a truck full of boys went by after dark and yelled something at the dark windows and threw a bottle that broke on the gatepost. The town had decided the Brevards were a joke, and a joke worth visiting. But the morning after that, Hattie went out to bring the broken glass up off the gravel, and there was a clay pot of late chrysanthemums sitting on the gatepost where the bottle had broken. No card, no name. Just the flowers set there in the half-light by hands she did not know. She stood holding the pot for a while. "Walter," she said when she came back inside. "What is it?" "Somebody left us flowers." He looked up from his coffee. "Who?" "I don't know. They didn't sign anything." He turned that around in his head. "Well," he said, "that's something." It was the first thing. The second thing came 2 days later. A basket of preserves on the step before either of them was up jars of peach and tomato and bread and butter pickles packed in clean straw, no card. The third was a pair of work gloves laid on the gatepost in a Ziploc bag against the weatherman's large the size of Walter's hands, with the price tag still on them. $8.99 from the hardware store in town, and somebody had paid it and left them where they would be found. Hattie carried the gloves inside and laid them on the hearth and looked at them a long time. "We don't know a soul who would do this," she said. "We don't," Walter said. "Then somebody knows us and isn't saying so." They sat with that. It was a stranger thing than the cruelty they could name. The kindness had no name on it at all. The first face that did show up belonged to Cora Bly. She came on a Wednesday in the middle of the day with her apron still on under her coat, which meant she had locked the diner up in the middle of dinner rush, and a paper bag of biscuits and a covered tin in her arms. "I'm not staying long," she said at the door, and then she stayed 3 hours. She set the food on the table and walked the room slow, looking at the walls. Walter had begun to repoint, looking at the place where the tarp came down off the rafters, looking at moss in his spot by the doorway. She did not look long at the back corner. Some people see a thing right away and have the manners to not stare at it. "Henry would have liked this kitchen," she said finally, of the bare stone room with the fire. "He always said a real house was just a fireplace and a roof and somebody to feed." "Sit down," Hattie said. "Sit, please. You've been on your feet since 5. "I came to bring you those," Cora said, "and I came to tell you something." She sat. She put her elbows on the table the way a woman does when she has carried a thing a long way. "There's a meeting at the courthouse 2 Thursdays from now. The council. Royce is going to bring up your cottage at it." "How do you know?" "I know because I have served that man coffee for 30 years and he tells the boys at the corner booth more than he ought to. He's calling for a confirmation of the condemnation order. Says the structure is a danger. Says the lot needs to be cleared." Cora looked at Walter directly. "He's going to ask the council to give him the demolition contract. And they will because the 4 other people on that council have all done business with him." The fire popped. Nobody said anything for a moment. 2 weeks, Hattie said. 2 weeks, Cora said. "I came out here to tell you that and to tell you something else." She took a breath. "When my Henry passed 11 years back," she said, "we couldn't pay for a proper marker. The funeral took everything. I told myself I'd save up and put one on him within the year. And the year went by and another year. And pretty soon a person stops believing she's going to do the thing she said she would." She turned a spoon over in her fingers. "One spring morning, I went up to the church cemetery, and there was a stone on his place. A real one, dressed and lettered and set straight, with his name and his dates, and a little carving of a bird at the bottom corner I'd never seen before. She lifted her eyes. I never paid for that stone. I never ordered it. The church secretary didn't know who'd brought it in. It just appeared. Hattie's hand had gone still on the table. Ansel Thorne, she said. I believe so, Cora said. I believe he did that for a lot of people. Quiet, and they died not knowing, and I lived not knowing, till it was too late to tell him thank you. She looked at Walter again. You're sleeping in his house. You're keeping his fire lit. And there's a man in town who wants to knock it down so he can build cul-de-sacs over the only thing that man ever made for himself. I'm not telling you what to do about it. I'm telling you what I'd think about if it was me. She stood up. She had not eaten any of what she brought. I'll come back, she said. You two need anything you can't ask for, ask me. She went out to her car, and Hattie watched her go from the doorway. And when the car was gone down the road, Hattie went back inside and sat by the fire a long time with her hand in her coat pocket. That night, Walter dreamed of the war memorial in the square with the wren cut into its corner and woke at 3 in the morning, sure of something he could not yet name. The dog was at the back wall again, lying flat now, with his nose pressed to the gap at the floor, breathing the cold air that came out of it. Walter watched him in the dark, and then quietly, without waking his wife, he got up and lit the lantern and went over and crouched beside the dog and put his hand on the dog's head. All right, he said. All right, old fellow, let's see what's got you. It took Walter the rest of that night and most of the next morning to clear the corner. The fallen shelf was heavy oak, a slab of a thing, and he could not lift it alone. And finally he woke Hattie, and the two of them walked it out of the corner, with a pry bar an inch at a time, neither of them speaking, because something about the room had changed, and they both felt it. Behind the shelf, the wall was buried under broken plaster, and a long drift of dead leaves and dirt that had blown in over 12 winters through some opening higher up they could not see. Walter knelt down with the lantern, and Moss pressed in tight at his shoulder, trembling, making that low note in his chest, and Walter began to clear the stone with his hands. He cleared down to the wall. At first, it looked like all the rest of the cottage stone, the same close field stone laid by the same patient hand running floor to ceiling. But Walter passed his palm across it slowly, reading it the way a man reads a thing he has spent his life with, and his hand stopped. One section about waist high and shoulder wide was wrong. The stones were the same. The joints around the edge of the section were not. They had been pointed with a softer mortar, a recent patching job by Thorne standards. And when Walter set his weight against the middle of the section, the whole panel gave by the smallest movement, and a breath of cold dead air came out of it, and the smell of dust and the smell of old worked wood. He sat back on his heels. He understood it then, and the understanding went all the way down his arms. It's not a wall, he said softly. It's a door dressed up as a wall. He worked the soft mortar out with the trowel coarse, by course his hands not entirely steady, and Hattie held the lantern close, and Moss pressed in between them and would not be moved. When the last of the mortar came free, the panel of facing stones swung back on a frame hinged and hidden behind it, and behind the panel stood a plain plank door swollen tight in its frame, grey with age. And in the center of the door, cut deep and clean into the old wood at the height of a man's heart, was a Wren. Hattie made a small sound. Walter put his hand flat against the door and felt the cold of it. Thorne, he said, what did you do back here? The door would not give to his hand. It had not been opened in over a decade, and the wood had locked itself to the frame in the damp. He set his shoulder to it and pushed, and it groaned and held, and he pushed again harder, and Moss began to bark. The third time he set his weight to it. The door tore free of the frame all at once and swung in, and a breath of cold dead air came out and over the three of them, and the dog went silent. Walter stood in the opening with the lantern up. For a moment the light only found dust hanging in the still air, and the dim shapes of things underneath it, and he could not make sense of what he was seeing. It was a workshop. That came clear first. A heavy timber bench ran along one side, and above it, hung on pegs in neat rows, were chisels and mallets and points, the tools of a stone carver, each one in its place with a film of grey dust over all of it. A grindstone stood in the corner. The floor was deep in stone chips that crunched under his boots when he stepped in. Then he lifted the lantern higher, and the light reached to the back of the room. Walter stopped breathing. Standing upright against the far wall, shoulder to shoulder in close rows, were headstones, real ones. Dressed slabs of the grey local limestone, each one squared and smoothed and standing on end. The nearest of them caught the lantern light across its face, and cut into it, deep and clean and beautiful, was a name. Eliza Pell, it said. And under the name, 2 dates. Behind it stood another, and behind that one another. Walter moved the light slow across the back of the room, and the rows kept going, stone after stone after stone, reaching back into the dark farther than the lantern could throw. Every one of them carved, every one of them a name. Walter Hattie whispered, "What is this?" He could not answer her. He went in among them with the lantern, and she came behind him with her hand on his back, and moss pressed at their legs, and the 3 of them walked into a room full of the dead. Some of the stones were finished down to the last letter, polished smooth at the top. Some were half-carved, named only the dates, waiting. Others were only roughed out a blank slab with a single small wren cut into the bottom corner. The bird always first. The bird before anything. Walter crouched by one of the finished ones and held the light close. The letters were cut so deep and square you could have read them with your fingers in the dark. Cyrus Penn, a span of years, and the wren. He stood up and his knees cracked loud in the silence, and he did not trust himself to speak. There were dozens of them. There were more than dozens. On the bench in the small clear circle of the lantern lay a book. It was a great thick ledger bound in cracked black cloth, and when Walter set the lantern beside it and opened the cover, the spine creaked and a little cloud of dust lifted off the pages. The paper was covered edge to edge in a careful, old-fashioned hand, the letters small and even a craftsman's writing. He turned to the first page and held the light close and read it out loud, because Hattie could not have read it in that light, and because it needed saying in a voice. For the ones the ground took with no name on them, Walter read. "Begun in the spring, I turned 60. I will get to as many as I am given time for. A stone is just a way of saying somebody was here, and somebody's sorry they're gone." Ansel Thorne, April 1992. Under that the list began, page after page of them. A name, 2 dates. A small number Walter would later understand was the county home's record number, the only bookkeeping the place had bothered to keep for the people it buried. And next to many of the names, a short line in that same small steady hand. Drowned in the spring flood. No people came. Died at the home winter of the fever. Infant 3 days, the mother passed the same week. A stranger off the rail line, nobody knew his name. So I gave him the day I found him. Walter set the lantern down on the bench and put his hand flat on the wood to steady himself. "It's the field," he said. "Hattie. It's the field down the road. The county home buried its dead out there with nothing on them. No stone, no name, just the ground. And Thorne." He looked around at the rows of patient stones standing in the dark. Thorne was making them a marker, one at a time, for nothing. Nobody asked him, and nobody paid him, and nobody knew. And he did it for the last decades of his life, and he died before he was finished. And it's been sitting back here in the dark the whole time. Hattie did not say anything. She had stopped a few feet back beside one of the half-finished stones, a small one the size men make for a child. She was standing very still. Her hand had gone into her left coat pocket. Her face had changed in a way that frightened him. "Hattie," he said. When she spoke, her voice did not sound like her voice. "He carved the little ones too," she said. "Look how small. That one's for a baby. Come away from there," Walter said gently. "Come sit down." She did not come away. She took the river stone out of her pocket, the smooth grey stone she had carried so long, and she held it out flat on her palm into the lantern light. And for the first time in their long marriage, she made him look at it close. It was a creek-bottom stone, palm-sized, and worn into the face of it, soft now under 50 years of her thumb, was a tiny carved bird. A fat little bird with its tail cocked up. A wren. "You know I had a baby before the others?" Hattie said, quiet and steady, looking at the stone and not at him. "You were there. Nobody had to tell you. We were 19 and we had nothing. She came too early in the January, and she lived 4 days and then she didn't. She turned the stone over in her fingers. We couldn't pay for a plot in the churchyard or for anything else. So the county took her and put her out in that field with the rest of the ones nobody could pay for. And they didn't mark it because marking it cost money too. And I couldn't even keep the spot in my head. I went back that spring to find her, and I couldn't tell one patch of grass from the next. And I sat down out there, and I thought, well, that's it then. She's gone twice now. Walter stood very still. He had not heard her say this many words about it in their whole life. They had carried it between them all that time, each of them holding their own end of it, and never once looking at it straight. And then I found this, Hattie said. Her thumb pressed the little bird, set right down on the bare dirt of a grave I'd given up finding. Somebody had been out there. Somebody I never met had taken a creek stone and carved a bird on it and laid it on my baby so she wouldn't be nothing. And I never knew who. For 50 years I never knew who. She lifted her eyes from the stone in her palm and looked around her at the rows and rows of carved names standing in the dark of that hidden room at the Wren cut into the bottom of every single one until right now. The lantern flame stood straight up in the still air. Moss had lain down against her feet and put his chin on her shoe. Thorne, Walter said. Thorne, she said, the hermit, the one they laughed at. He went out to a stranger's dead baby in a field of no names, and he gave her a bird so she'd have something. Her hand closed around the stone. And we bought his house for $11 and they laughed at us too. Walter looked at the small unfinished stone she had been standing over the child-sized one, the dates not yet cut into it. He thought about a man going out alone to a field of forgotten people and starting in at 60 on a job he had to have known he would never live to see the end of. About what makes a person do a thing like that. He couldn't save any of them, Walter said. They were already gone. He just would not let them be nobody. That was the whole of it. He bent down and helped his wife up off the cold stone floor and held onto her hand. Come on now, he said. We're not leaving anyone out here in the dark tonight. He meant the stones, and he meant her, and he meant all of it. They were 3 days into the ledger reading the dead by firelight, sleeping in pieces finding names. Hattie knew the legless man who had waited by the kitchen door at the county home for the burnt heel of bread. When she was 19, the woman who had washed beside her. The man who tended the boilers, all of them out under that grass. All of them set down in this book in a stranger's careful hand. They were 3 days in, and they had counted past 200 and not reached the end of the names. They had begun to plan how, with the truck and Walter's bad knee and Hattie's hands, they might carry the finished stones the half-mile down the road to the field where they belonged. That was the morning the orange paper went up on the birch at the gate. The man who tacked it there did not enjoy his work. He was wearing a county windbreaker, and he had a clipboard and a sheaf of similar notices, and he stood in the wet grass and held out the page to Walter with a kind of apology in his face. Mr. Brevard, Code Enforcement, he said. I'm real sorry to do this. Structure was condemned years back, and there's an order now to demolish. You have till the council meeting a week from Thursday to clear out your belongings. After the meeting confirms it, the contractor takes it down. Walter took the paper and read it. At the bottom, under the county seal, was the name of the demolition contractor that had won the work. It was the same name as the development company that had bought the field. It was Royce. The same week as the field, Walter said, Sir Nothing. Walter folded the orange notice in half and put it in his shirt pocket against his heart. That night, somebody came up the road in the dark and threw a brick through the window of the front room and another one onto the tarp on the roof. The first brick broke the lantern they had bought with their last bills at the hardware store. The second brick tore a hole in the tarp the rain would find by morning. Moss caught one of them by the calf as he was running back to the truck on the road, and the man kicked the dog and got into the cab, and they spun gravel and were gone. Walter found Moss limping at the gate with blood on his muzzle. He carried the dog inside in his arms, sat down with him on the hearthstone, and Hattie washed the cut on the dog's flank with warm water by the light of the fire because they had no lantern anymore. She did not cry. She washed the dog and she put her hand on his head a long time, and then she set the basin down and looked at her husband across the firelight, and her voice was very small. Walter, she said, maybe this town does not want to remember. Maybe we should let her sleep. He could not answer her. He looked at her, and he understood that she was talking about the baby, and he understood that for the first time in this whole hard year and a half, she was willing to set something down she had been carrying, and that the setting down would cost her the rest of what she had. Behind her on the hearthstone, her old denim purse lay open on its side from where she had dropped it when she ran to the dog. A square of color had slid halfway out of the pocket of it, the kind of square that has weather on it because it has been carried in a pocket a long time. A postcard. Walter reached over and picked it up. It was a cheap drugstore postcard. A picture of a desert sunset on the front, the colors gone soft from being kept. He turned it over. His son's handwriting. 8 months old. The postmark from a town in Tennessee that Walter had never been to. Mama, the postcard said, I don't know how to come back. I have tried to write this thing 50 times, and every time I sit down, I am still the man who took the house. But I am trying. I am working at a body shop here. I have a daughter you have never met, and she is 12, and her name is Sadie, and she asks about you. If there is any way for me to make this right, I will spend the rest of my life on it. I don't expect an answer. I just needed you to know I am out here, and I have not stopped being yours. Eli. Walter read it once. He read it twice. He did not look up at his wife. He set the postcard down on the hearthstone between them, picture side up. And then a sound came from the road, and they both turned. A car was pulling slow into the gate. Not a truck. A car. The headlights came up the gravel and stopped at the gatepost, the engine cut, and the door opened, and a man got out and stood there in the dark with his hands at his sides. Behind him on the passenger side, a smaller door opened, and a girl of 12 in a denim jacket stepped down onto the gravel and stood looking at the cottage with both hands in her pockets. The man did not come through the gate. He did not call out. He just stood there in the headlights of his own car, looking at the broken window, at the torn tarp, at the dog in his mother's lap on the hearthstone framed in the fire-lit doorway like a painting. Mama, he said, and that was all he could get out. Hattie stood up from the hearthstone, with Moss still half on her lap, and the dog steadied himself on 3 legs and pressed in against her hip, and she walked out into the cold yard in her stocking feet, without thinking to put on shoes. The headlights of her son's car made a long white path across the wet grass, and she walked it. He had not moved from the gate. He stood there with his hands at his sides like a boy waiting to be sent to his room, and he did not look like a man of 45. He looked like everything he had ever been at once. Mama, he said again, and his voice broke on the second syllable. She stopped a step in front of him. She did not embrace him yet. She looked up into her son's face by the dome light of his own car. The gray coming in at his temples she had not been there to see, and she put her cold hand flat against his cheek, the way she had 1,000 times before he was tall enough to bend down for it. You came, she said. I read the story. He said it like he was confessing to something. The paper out of Roanoke. They ran a piece on the $11 and the cottage, and your name was right there in the print. And I just got in the car. I didn't even... He stopped. I didn't even know where you'd gone, Mama. After what I did, I couldn't make myself call. And I just kept thinking somebody else would tell me you were all right. And nobody did because there was nobody to. We're all right, Hattie said. You're living in a condemned house. We're sleeping fine. He looked at the broken window at the torn tarp pale against the sky. I took your house, he said. The words came out in pieces. I took everything you had, and you are sleeping on a stone floor because of me, and I do not know how you let me stand at your gate. Walter had come up behind her by then, slow on the bad knee with the postcard still in his hand. He stepped past his wife. He stopped in front of his son, and he looked at him a long moment in the headlight glow. And then he did what he had done at the courthouse steps. He laid his big rough hand flat between the man's shoulder blades, and he held it there. I didn't lose the money, son, Walter said. I lost you for a while, and that's the only thing I ever sat up nights counting. The money was always just money. You're the part I wanted back. Eli put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook once hard. And that was as much as he could do in front of his own daughter. Sadie had come around the front of the car by then, 12 years old, in a thin denim jacket, and the kind of careful expression a child makes when she is meeting 2 strangers who are also her grandparents. She had her father's chin. She had her grandmother's eyes, though nobody had ever told her so. You must be Sadie, Hattie said. I brought a flashlight, Sadie said, holding it up. Dad said your window was broken. I thought it might help. It will, Hattie said. Come inside, child. Come meet the dog. Eli stayed 2 weeks. He took a room above the diner that Cora Bly would not let him pay for. And every morning before light, he was at the gate with 2 cups of bad gas station coffee. And he worked beside his father in the cold barn of the back workshop until the sun came over the ridge and the stone began to warm. He could not carve, and he did not pretend he could. What he could do was lift. He had the back his father had given him and had not had for 30 years. And he set himself to the work of bringing the finished stones up out of the dark room one at a time and stacking them gently in the yard. Walter steadied each one as Eli carried it. Sadie wrapped straw around the bases against the chipping. Hattie kept the ledger open on the bench and crossed off names with a pencil as the stones came out into the light, and her crossings were not crossings, but a small wren drawn in the margin beside the name, because she could not bring herself to put a line through any of them. By the second day, the stones stood in long rows in the front yard, faces turned toward the road. It changed the look of a slowing car right quick. A pickup that meant to cruise by laughing instead drifted off the gravel and stopped at the gate, and a man in a feed store cap got out and walked the rows with his cap held against his chest. And at one of the stones, he stopped and stood a long while, and then he came back to his truck and drove off without ever saying a word to anyone. 2 days later, he was back with a box of canning jars full of apple butter set on the gatepost without a note, and an old hand pump well bucket he had been keeping in his barn, and he left those there too. He did not knock. He did not want to be thanked. He just wanted to be on the right side of something for once. It went like that. By the end of the first week, the gatepost had become an altar of the kind a small town builds when it is finally embarrassed of itself. Jars of preserves, a handmade quilt folded in a clean trash bag against the weather, a box of nails, a bag of oranges from the only fruit stand on the highway, a scribbled note on the back of a receipt that said, "Only I lived 3 doors down from him for 20 years, and I never once asked his name. I'm sorry." Hattie kept the notes in the ledger like bookmarks at the pages of the dead they belonged to. The day before the council meeting, Walter sat down at the bench in the back room with a clean blank stone the size of his forearm and a chisel, and he began to cut letters into it himself. He had not carved letters in 50 years. The first ones were not good. The second row was better. By the end of the afternoon, he had set down a name in the patient deep cut of a man who had remembered something his hands had not forgotten. And Sadie stood at his elbow the whole time and did not speak. "What's that one?" she said when he was done. "He's not in the ledger," Walter said. "I asked at the diner. Cora knew him. There was a man slept under the bridge at the edge of town for years, never told anyone his name, and they buried him when he went without putting one on him because nobody knew it. So I put down what they did know." He took up a clean rag and wiped the chips off the face of the stone. The carving read, "John of the Bridge." 2 dates Cora had been able to recall, and in the corner where it always went, Walter had cut the bird. It was not as fine as Thorne's. It was a wren all the same. Sadie put her hand on the corner of the stone. "Can I learn how to do that?" she asked. "You can learn how," Walter said. "It takes a lifetime to do it right." "I have a lifetime," she said. He looked at his granddaughter for a long moment. He nodded once and he set the chisel into her small hand and his big hand around hers. And that was the beginning of something he would not live to see the end of. And he did not need to. The council met on the second Thursday in the room at the courthouse, where the county did its business, and that room was always empty for these meetings. 4 members and Royce Van Meter at the head, a clerk, a few folding chairs nobody ever sat in. It was not empty that night, folks had heard. The chairs filled, and then the standing room along the back wall filled, and then the hall outside the door filled, and Cora was at the front, and the man from the feed store was leaning against the radiator. And the woman who had left the chrysanthemums on the gatepost was standing very straight by the window, with a handkerchief held in her fist. And the young reporter from the paper had her notebook open on her knee, and at the very back, in a long row, were the Brevards, Walter, Hattie, Eli, Sadie, and the dog at Sadie's feet, because nobody had said he could not come, and so he had. Royce Van Meter sat at the head of the table and watched the room fill, and did not look as easy as he liked to look. He gavelled it to order and ran quick through the small business, and then he came to the last item, and he kept his voice reasonable and warm. Last thing he said, "The county's clearing the old home tract for the Calder Heights development approved last winter. There's a condemned structure on the lot next to it, the old Thorne place that's part of the cleanup. I know there's been feeling about it, and I understand that. But feeling doesn't change that we are talking about open ground and a building that's a hazard. I'll take a motion to confirm the demolition and clearing as already permitted. He should have had his motion in 5 seconds. Instead, Walter Brevard stood up in the back row, and his wife stood with him, and his son stood, and his granddaughter, and Walter said, "Before you vote, I would like the town to see what it is voting to bulldoze." He and Eli walked up the center aisle carrying a headstone between them. They had wrapped it in a clean sheet from the bedroll, and at the front of the room, they set it on the council's long table sheet, and all. And the sound of 100 pounds of stone coming down on the wood went through the whole silent room. Walter pulled the sheet off it. "This is one of more than 300 names," Walter said. "A man named Ansel Thorne, who this town gave its stonework to for 40 years, and called the hermit for his trouble, set himself to carve a marker for every soul the county buried in that field, with nothing over them. The poor, the strangers, the ones who died at the home with no people to come for them. He spent the last 20 years of his life at it, and he never charged a cent, and he carved every stone his hands had time for, and wrote the rest down in a book, and he died before he could carry a single one of them out there. They have stood sealed inside the wall of the house you mean to knock down. That field is not open land. It is the most crowded ground in this county. You have just never had to look at it." Then Hattie opened the ledger on the table, and she began to read. She read the names, slow in her plain voice, one after another. She had marked the pages in the long week between, and now. As she read, she lifted her eyes between names and let them find faces in the room. She read out the name of the church sweeper, the one Cora had told them about, and a woman in the third row covered her mouth. She read the 7 children who had died the summer of the fever back in 1944, the summer everybody's grandmother still half remembered, and nobody had ever once marked. And an old farmer near the radiator pulled out a red bandana and pressed it to his face and did not put it down again. She read out the name of the old man with no legs who had waited by the kitchen door of the county home for the burnt heel of bread. And she said his middle name was Wilbur, and that he had been a soldier in the First War, and a woman at the back said out loud, "Wilbur," in the voice of someone calling a child in from the dusk. Up at the table, Sadie had moved without being asked. She was standing beside the stone with one hand resting on the top of it, 12 years old and steady as a fence post, having appointed herself its guard. Hattie read another name, and a man in a canvas coat stood up out of his chair and said, "That is my grandfather's brother. We never knew where he went." He sat back down with his hand over his mouth. Somebody by the window said, "Lord, that's old Hovey. He mended chairs." And somebody else said, "I remember him." And that was the thing, that all over the room people were starting to remember. Names coming back up out of the place the town had let them sink to. A man Hattie did not know put his hand flat against the back wall to keep his feet. Cora Bly had taken off her glasses and was crying so quietly her shoulders did not move. Then Hattie stopped reading. She looked up the length of the room at the head of the table. She picked up a smaller stone from where Eli had set it on the floor beside the table, a child-sized stone, and she carried it down the center aisle to the council's table herself. She set it gently on the wood in front of Royce Van Meter. "This one," she said, "I believe is yours." Royce looked down at it. The whole room had gone dead silent. Cut into the small stone was the name Lottie Van Meter, a single year 80 years ago, and the Wren. He did not say anything for a long moment. He put 2 fingers on the cold top of the small stone, needing to be sure of its weight. When he spoke, his voice did not sound like his voice. "My mother had a baby before me," he said to nobody in particular. "A girl. She lost her at the home before I was born. She only ever spoke of it the one time the year before she died, and she said nobody had told her where they put the baby, and she had gone looking and could not find the place. She said she had gone to her own grave not knowing." He looked up. How did he know that? "He went and learned her," Hattie said. "When there was nobody left in the world who remembered she'd ever had a name, he went and learned it and he cut it true. Same as he did for my own daughter, who is out in that field too." Her voice did not shake. "You were going to pave your own sister under a parking lot, Royce," she said. "You would never even have known she was down there to be sorry to." There was no motion to demolish. There was no vote at all. Royce Van Meter sat at the head of the table with his hand on his sister's stone and could not get a word out. And after a moment, the oldest woman on the council leaned to her microphone and said in a thick voice that she moved they table the clearing indefinitely and form a committee to survey and protect the field. It was seconded before she finished saying it. It carried with Royce abstaining because he had his face in his hands. The Brevards walked out of that room together that night, the four of them and the dog, and not one person in that hall said a word against them. It was past midnight before Walter could sit down. Cora had locked up the diner without serving the dinner shift and brought a pie. The young reporter was on the phone in the hall to her editor with her voice up and her cheeks pink. Eli had Sadie asleep against his shoulder in a chair by the fire. Hattie sat at the bench in the back room with the ledger open under the lantern, and the last page she had not read was open in front of her. She turned it. Her finger went down the column. She knew before she found it. Brevard, infant daughter. The hard winter, January 1973. And next to the name in Ansel Thorne's small steady hand, 4 words. She stared at them a long time. She took the lantern off the bench and she walked out into the dark room of finished stones and she went down the rows. She did not call Walter. She wanted the next minute for herself. Most of the way down the last row near the wall, she found a small stone the size of her forearm. She set the lantern on the floor and got down on her knees in the stone chips, and she put her hands flat against the cold face of it. Junia Brevard, it said, a single winter, the dates the same, and in the corner, the bird. She had not said the name out loud to a living soul in 50 years. She had given it to her baby in the county ward, in the hour before the baby was taken from her arms, and she had folded the name into a place no one else had been allowed in, and she had carried it there with the river stone every day since. And a man she had never met had reached out of the dark and called her daughter by the name only she had known. She took the river stone out of her pocket. She held it in her palm in the lantern light. The small soft bird worn nearly away under the long work of her thumb. And she looked at the bird on the carved face of the stone, the same bird made by the same hand. And a sound came out of her that Walter in the next room had waited all their marriage to hear. It was not grief held in. It was grief finally let go. He came when he heard her. He sat down beside her in the stone chips. He did not ask her to explain. She gave him the river stone and he closed his hand around it, and then she gave him the name. Junia, she said. Walter? Her name was Junia. I know it now, he said. She's in the field, she said. She's in the field, and her stone is right here. And Ansel Thorne knew her name when I never once said it. He put his arm around his wife and he held her there while the lantern burned down. And after a long time he said then, we'd better get her home. The day they set the stones in the field, spring had come early to the Blue Ridge, and the grass was that first hard green that has not yet been touched by summer. Half the county came out for it. The man from the feed store, the woman with the chrysanthemums, Cora with the diner shut and a sign on the door that said, gone to the field, back tomorrow. The young reporter with her notebook closed because there was nothing to write that the day would not say better. A man who had driven 4 hours because of a great uncle. A dozen strangers who had nobody out there at all and had come anyway to carry a stone because a stone needed carrying. Sadie ran water up and down the rows in an old enameled jug. Eli carried slabs his father could no longer lift. The committee had brought ground-sounding equipment, and between Ansel Thorne's careful map at the back of the ledger and Walter's eye reading the humps of the long grass, every name found its patch of earth. By the time the sun was high, 240 markers stood in the field where there had been only grass at dawn. They saved Junia's stone for last and they carried it out themselves, just the family. Eli dug the small hole. Walter set the stone. Sadie packed the earth around the base with her own hands. Hattie stood with the river stone in her palm, and then she bent and laid it gently at the foot of the marker. There, she said softly, now you've got them both. Sadie looked at the carved name in the new sun. Hi, Della, she said. And then she stopped and Hattie put her hand on her granddaughter's shoulder and said the right name out loud at last, the way you teach a child a thing for keeping. Junia, Hattie said. Hi, Junia, Sadie said. And her grandmother laughed and cried at the same time. And that was the whole of the service, and it was enough. That summer, Walter put a slate roof on the cottage, and he opened Ansel Thorne's sealed workshop to the air and the light. And he worked in it because there were hundreds of names still in the ledger with no stone cut for them. And a man who could lay stone and would not take $1 for it was exactly what those names had been waiting on. He taught Sadie to hold a chisel. She ruined 3 blanks learning the angle. On the 4th, with his big hand laid over hers, she cut a clean small wren that would have made the old Cornishman nod. She kept that blank. She would not let him use it for anybody. They were not hard to find anymore. People came up the path on Saturdays with addresses worn soft in their hands, looking for a brother. Nobody had marked a great-aunt. The family had lost track of a father. A daughter had aged out of foster care, never knowing. Hattie sat them at the kitchen table and gave them coffee and opened the ledger and ran her finger down the columns until she found the name, and then she turned the book so they could read it themselves in a stranger's careful hand. That November, the cottage with its new slate roof held Thanksgiving for 11 again. Cora brought 3 pies and would not hear about leaving after. The daughter flew in from Phoenix. The youngest sent a long letter you could tell had taken him 3 tries to write. Eli carved the turkey badly, and Sadie corrected him in front of everyone. Moss worked the floor under the table for whatever fell. Down the road in the late blue light, the field lay quiet under its stones. The air smelled like wet leaves, and the wood smoke from a chimney that drew clean for the first time in 12 winters. And every name out there had people now, because 2 old fools nobody had wanted had decided that it would be so. On the last evening of that summer, Walter walked out to the field alone with the dog and stopped at the small stone at the end of the row. The river stone sat against the base where Hattie had laid it. The wren in the corner caught the last of the sun. Out across the field, hundreds of markers stood in their patient rows, every one of them a name the world had thrown away, and one stubborn old foreigner had refused to let go of. And now there were a few stubborn brevards to keep refusing after him, and a girl who could already cut the bird. Walter laid his hand flat on the cold top of his daughter's stone. The same hand he had laid flat on a cottage wall the morning he knew a master had been there before him. Then he stood up slow and whistled the dog in, and the 2 of them walked back up the gravel road toward the lit window and the smell of supper. Behind them, the field held its names quietly in the dropping light, and not one of them was alone anymore. A person does not really leave when the breath leaves. A person leaves when there is no one left to call the name. And sometimes the people who keep calling are not the ones we were born to. Sometimes they are the strangers who cut our name into stone when there was nothing in it for them, and the strangers we become for someone else when our own grief teaches us how. Somewhere in your life there has been a quiet person, a neighbor, a teacher, a worker, on the edge of a room who carved your name into something and walked away before you could say thank you. Tonight before you sleep, would you say the name aloud, just the once into the dark of your room for them? Sleep gently. They are still with you. They have been all along.